Hi, everybody. This is Nick Bravulis. I'm the editor of Educational Theory. This is another in a series of interviews we're doing with authors and guest editors of articles and papers in our journal. Today, we're joined by Heather Greenhalgh-Spencer and Amy Shuffelton, who are co-guest editing a symposium entitled Building Bridges. Heather, Amy, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
So let's
good to
just
be
get
here.
started. Thanks, Amy. Let's just get started. So the metaphor of building bridges comes up all the time in international diplomacy, in marriage counseling, in dealing with miscommunications of all sorts, and of course, especially in education. I'm interested in the recurring appeal of this metaphor, of this imagery that keeps coming back again and again. Why do we keep talking about the importance of building bridges? What does that desire or importance come from?
Amy, you okay if I start and then you can tag on? Is that all right?
Absolutely.
So I think for me, one of the things that most interested me about that idea, and honestly, building bridges was a theme of the conference that also where a lot of these articles were culled from, came about not only because we're in Pittsburgh and it's a city of bridges, but I think really because we wanted to parse out and maybe question and push back against the sort of triteness that has come to surround the idea of building bridges. I think you're right, I think we do use that terminology a lot, and it flips off the tongue without really thinking about, should we be building bridges? What kind of labor goes into building bridges? I think sometimes we forget that there is labor and there is time that goes into building bridges. And at least when we're using this as a metaphor for communication, it's not just a matter of, hey, I want to build a bridge, therefore the bridge will be created. It requires labor from multiple parties. And I think thinking about what does that labor look like? When is it important? Why is it important? When do you do it? When is it not worth doing? And I think for me, even more interestingly, is there something to building a bridge, even if you know that in the end the bridge will be destroyed, that still makes it worth doing? Or starting the bridge building, even if you know that when you're starting to make the bridge on your side, there's a possibility that someone on the other side of the chasm may not be so interested in starting on their side. I think those are questions that we don't largely bring up and think through when we use that terminology. And I think living in such a divided time, a very fraught time where polarization becomes more salient even than class markers and gender markers. I recently had the opportunity to read this book about social class that was written in the 80s and I guess early 90s. And it was this interesting thing because the author made the case that, oh, politics doesn't matter. Nobody cares what kind of sign you put on your yard. Social class is so much more salient and meaningful than just about any demarcator. And I thought, man, that just does not seem true now, and not just in the US context, in many different contexts. I really believe in, honestly, if you read our introduction, you'll actually see data on this, that we are living through a much more divided and polarized time than just about any time at least the last 200 years of our political history, as a group of nations in Europe, in Asia, in the US. And so thinking about what does it mean in that kind of polarized landscape to think about building bridges and when to do it and when not to do it and how to do it, I just thought that became much more important as a conversational starter. But that was my thought. Amy.
I mean, you've put it very beautifully. I'm not sure how much I have to add to that, except maybe this, just to riff for a moment more on the topic of Pittsburgh, right? Because that's what got the bridges bit in our heads in the first place. And of course, Pittsburgh, if you know the geography at all, the reason there's so many bridges is it's the confluence of two rivers, right? Two rivers come together and they create a third river, and I think the third is the Ohio. But it's something that happens in nature very easily, right? I mean, those two rivers, they just come and they join, and the water is all one water, and off they go, and down it goes to join the Mississippi, and easy peasy. But for humans, it's not so simple, right? And of course, it's exactly the confluence of those rivers that create it. It's the things coming together that were different that creates the need for all the bridges, and that then creates, I mean, really a technological problem for humans. Right? If these things are coming together and they're creating something new, how do we get from here to here? How do we cross? How do we make these connections? So I think thinking of it in terms of just like the literal natural forces that were going on, and the acts of human ingenuity, as Heather said, that had to be made and then remade and maybe unmade, and maybe they worked, and maybe that, and any bridge that you make can fail, can fall in, etc. But I think it's a pretty potent metaphor.
Yeah, thanks both of you. So just a little background, you both alluded to it. These papers were originally presented at the Philosophy of Education Society meeting held in Pittsburgh, hence the connection with Pittsburgh and the bridges in Pittsburgh. So I think you both put your finger on a theme that I'd like to follow up on, which is that the papers in the set range from, I would say, very positive accounts of the importance and value and possibility of building bridges across culture, difference, identity, political disagreements, etc., and other papers that are much more skeptical about the possibility or even the desirability of trying to build bridges under certain circumstances. And I think that's part of what's interesting about the set. They're not all celebratory about, woohoo, let's build bridges, and well, everything will be kumbaya, we'll all understand and understand and agree with each other. All the papers, positive or negative, are very honest about the difficulties and the impediments to trying to build bridges, even under circumstances where there is goodwill and positive intention. And of course, in many situations, there isn't goodwill or there isn't positive intention. And the prospects of building bridges, as you said, Heather, you're working on one side, but there's not a corresponding effort on the other side. Can you both say some more about why people might be skeptical about the value or possibility or even desirability of building bridges under certain circumstances?
If I can start, I think two good examples from this issue. There's a beautiful piece by Sean Henry about building bridges between the LGBT community and religious education in schools in Ireland. And I mean, and he's writing it as a gay identifying man, and there you have some reason to be skeptical, right? Because there's sure, it would be great if everybody could get along, but powers are not equal. One group is more in charge of the school system than the others. Building that bridge can require some things, replacing some things, neglecting some things, right? So there's one reason to be skeptical. Another good example is Naoko Saito's piece in the book, where she talks about the ways bridging binaries between masculine and feminine. I think feminism has a lot to say, going back to Heather's point about who's building these bridges, right? Is that it's work, there's work there, who's doing that work? So I think many marginalized groups would be able to point to this bridge building work and say, we're building a lot of bridges here, and what are we really getting from it? So I think both of those pieces speak to that really nicely.
Yeah. Thank you, Heather.
I'll just add, I agree. I think Sean Henry's piece is skeptical but hopeful. I feel the same way about Naoko Saito's. Honestly, even Sandra Vanderbilt, which is really kind of focusing on what kind of activism happens in the privacy of the home, of those home conversations. To me, actually, one of the interesting pieces is the one by Gabe Keane, where he actually talks about the potency of bridges that are built in right-wing, alt-right conservative spaces, the idea of memes bridging into this sort of common understanding in alt-right. And it's a lovely take, because so often we see this kind of idea of, well, if the bridge works, then ta-da, you know, we've accomplished something. Whereas his paper really comes from the perspective of, oh, this bridge works. This bridge is amazing. It's really efficacious, but the thing that it's building is awful. And so kind of getting into this idea of not just the process of building the bridge, but who does the bridge serve in the end, I think is also cause for skepticism that I think that his paper brings out really well.
Yeah, thank you both. So you've reviewed 4 of the 5 papers in the set, and the 5th paper is by Heather. So Amy, I'll ask you to give a brief summary of Heather's paper.
Wait. He takes up a bunch of the issues that we've talked about so far. I mean, you know, as the editor, I think she's tuned into all of this stuff. I'm not giving a very good summary of it. It's hard to summarize something in front of its own author. I'm tongue-tied here.
She talks about the role of listening in bridge building.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting, I'll share a little bit too. I think it's an interesting insight, because we tend to think about these situations as talky situations where the bridge building happens by people saying things to one another. But of course, obviously, it's not sufficient if people are saying things if other people aren't also listening, actively listening, sympathetically listening, empathetically listening. And so listening, and then you both know this is something I'm also interested in as well. Listening is actually a very complicated activity, which has its own skill set, which plays a crucial role in the dynamics of conversation. And I think Heather's paper does a really nice job of fleshing out some of those complexities and nuances. It's not just keeping your ears open. There's an active, even emotional component to effective listening that is more than just understanding the words that are being said.
Well, I appreciate that, both Nick and Amy. And I will say one of the things that I was thinking about when I was reviewing all of the articles for this special issue is that while listening is important, and it's definitely brought up in my paper as well as others, it's also interesting to think about how deep listening must also coexist with good judgment. And I think that's another thing that kind of gets brought up in all of the papers, that there is this sort of sense of I need to actively listen and understand how my listening to you changes what I'm going to say next, changes what I'm offering. I talk about school partnerships, changes what emerges from the school partnerships. But also there is this sense of judgment that must always go on. And I don't mean like biblical judgment or being judgy, but this sense of the entire time there has to be a sense of judging whether or not the bridge should continue to be built, whether or not if I am creating more labor or doing more of it than the other party, is that still okay? Are we building something that basically is going to turn into a speedy highway for doom? But that idea of judgment as coexisting with listening was something that emerged for me the last time I read the articles in this issue.
Yeah. So I think I like the way that ties in with some of the I mean, like with Gabe's bit about the way language creates these bridges. Of course, someone has to be listening to it. Yeah, and with the other pieces too, about the work that whose people are doing and who it helps.
So thank you both. This is a really interesting set of papers. Your introduction, I think, also adds an important element to the conversation as well. But they're 5 really interesting papers. They're all tied together thematically, but as you can already see, they come from 5 very distinct sorts of positions and problem sets. And in that sense, the set itself is a kind of exercise in bridge building. So thank you for your work as guest editors on this project. Thank you for your time and talking to me today. It's a pleasure to see you both.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much.